Human Accomplishment by Charles Murray. This is the third video I'm doing about this book, and there will definitely be a fourth installment, and possibly a fifth if I have enough time. So I'm going to get right to it here. In the first two videos, parts 1 and 2, I covered popular misconceptions about the production of human accomplishment, or as Charles Murray calls it, the production of significant figures in their respective fields. So people like Leonardo da Vinci and Einstein. So in the first video I covered the sort of popular belief that population matters. And so the idea is that out of 1 billion people you're going to find one sort of super genius that can change the world. But his quantitative analysis showed that that's not the case. And I went over in part 1 about why it's only the case for Europe and the United States around the year 1400 and later. Then the other popular misconception is that you need peace and prosperity, and I covered those two in part 2 of this series. There's not enough peace in the world throughout history to make a good judgment about this. That's sort of a sad fact. And in fact, there's actually counter examples such as ancient Athens, and that produced lots of significant figures in lots of different fields. And I brought in Nassim Taleb, who wrote in his book Anti-Fragile about something sort of like the opposite of PTSD, and it's sort of post-traumatic growth syndrome. So it sort of produced super productive people after they encountered such stress. And I also covered in that second part prosperity. Some people think a civilization has to be wealthy in order to produce great art or science, and that's true to some extent. So there needs to be a minimum level of wealth in the society. You need to have people who are secure in their housing, in their basic needs. In other words, they need to have their basic needs met in order to start thinking about something other than their basic needs. So once that minimum level of prosperity is reached, then people can start to, or then a society can start producing significant figures significantly. So there's 3 more things that we're going to consider that Murray brings up in the next chapter. He calls it models, elite cities, and freedom of action. So models are exactly what you think, that human accomplishment becomes self-reinforcing as new artists and scientists build on the models before them, on the people who sort of made the path ahead of them. So they follow in their footsteps. Elite cities, he calls this a critical mass. Cities serve as centers of human capital and supply audiences and patrons for the arts and sciences. Freedom of action is where regimes give de facto freedom of action to their potential artists and scholars, which foster human accomplishment. And so that's just a broad brush of what these terms mean to him. And now I'm just going to cover them briefly. So the gist of the theory about models is simple enough. Significant figures in any given field present their success as a model for future generations to be successful, or even contemporaries. Murray cites Dean Simonton, who in the 70s created the first real quantitative analysis of significant figures in the West and in the East. Murray's inventories of significant figures allowed for a replication of this type of analysis, and he found very similar results. It does appear that the production of significant figures is enhanced by having some models to guide people. The effects are strongest within 2 generations or so. This makes sense in fields that are changing rapidly, or societies that are also changing rapidly, since the path to success is probably also changing. Now, what's interesting here is that this sort of is the argument that Sam Harris is making to Jordan Peterson, and Matt Dillahunty is making to Jordan Peterson, regarding the models we find in the Bible. They are claiming that they're 2,000-year-old models the path to success that's presented in these old books is not any more relevant today. And what Jordan Peterson is arguing is that the path to success, broadly speaking, is about the human being, and Jordan takes a psychological look at the human being, and that path has not changed because human beings have not changed. Whereas the path Thomas Edison might have taken to invent something has definitely changed over the last 100 years. And there you could argue the same path is not as easily walked as it might have been 100 years ago. Or maybe you need a completely different kind of way of looking at the world in order to make a sort of success as Thomas Edison has. Now the second theory is elite cities, and the name kind of gives it away. It's not just cities that he's talking about. So it's a subtle point here, and he says it's not like saying that restaurants are the cause of cooking. Something more interesting was actually happening in cities. Murray brings up the point that significant figures did not just work or perform in cities, they were born and raised in them too. A common misunderstanding is that, of course, because cities are the most populated, therefore you're going to have lots of interesting people and interesting things developing in them. But if you compare cities by population to surrounding areas of that country with the same population, Murray found a ratio of around 20 to 2 on average, if you average them out, of cities producing significant figures. And I have the picture of this so that you can see the sort of write-up that he did. I think it's on the next slide. But so elite cities continued. But if one points to big cities as centers of significant figures production at any given time period and location, you will of course find cities to point to that demonstrate your point, as Murray does. But he also looks at the other side of the coin. Just as many big cities in all time periods and locations also produce next to no significant figures. So this is the interesting thing. So what made the cities that did produce significant figures different from those that did not? Murray highlights 4 cities and their respective countries: London, Paris, Naples, and Germany. There's just too many cities. He couldn't focus on just one, which is the interesting thing about Germany. So here's the little chart he did regarding the actual cities. So he's comparing the city to the area around the city that has a similar population. And even with the similar population in a similar geographical area, you can see that somewhere like Vienna in Austria, Lower Austria, produced an average of 12 significant figures, and the area around it per million produced 2. And you can just go down the list, and if you average them up, he found an average of 20 to 2 significant figures per million coming out of the city versus the area surrounding it. So population couldn't really be a factor in that regard. There's something special about the cities. And here, this is the comparison of the 4 cities I just mentioned in Germany. So you have Naples in Italy, which is, I think, circled. Oh, he has many things circled here. So you have Naples in Italy, which doesn't really fit in with the Italian story, or actually any of the stories of the cities, because the theory is that cities are producing significant figures, and Naples wasn't in the time of the Renaissance, during Italy's great period of producing significant figures. So why wasn't Naples producing? Then here, if you look at France, you're going to see that Paris is sort of this huge magnet, and all the rest of Paris is sort of just being sucked up into this this magnet of significant figures. We're going to get into why that is. And then here you see London is also showing a huge population of production of significant figures, but there's still a lot of significant figures from other areas around England. And then Germany is just sort of, or what is, roughly Germany. We're going to get into that too. Has just figures scattered through several major cities and all over the country. So elite cities continued. Now we're going to get into his breakdown of these cities. So London was, of course, a huge significant figure generator for England. Now, of note in these comparisons is that it also served as a financial, political, and cultural center for the country. So that's one of the key things about London, the financial, political, and cultural center for the country. Naples didn't generate many significant figures for Italy, even during its prime time for significant figure generation during the Renaissance. But one should note that Naples was less a part of the Renaissance Italy and more a part of the Spanish Habsburgs who ruled them at the time. So through such a political difference, one could make the argument that they had a different culture ruling over them, and therefore, the significant figure production just wasn't there. Paris is another interesting case. It produced many significant figures for France, and France itself is an interesting case as it was the most centralized nation in Europe. So it was centralized in terms of its population, government, and culture. Everything sort of hovered around Paris. As such, you can see the large blob of significant figures produced by Paris compared to the rest of the country. It was as if Paris was sucking up all the significant figures in the nation. And Germany is the final case that he highlights. It demonstrates yet another principle, and that's far from being centralized like France was. It was basically the most decentralized. So it's not what we think of as modern Germany, but something much, much more different. And it drew its historically it drew its significant figures from all around that so-called nation. Yet even in this highly politically, financially, and culturally decentralized nation, there were still cities, I think there were 12 cities that still played an important role in generating significant figures. So what could a possible common thread be among these disparate examples of cities that produced significant figures for their respective nations? It isn't necessarily being a center of the nation in a political, financial, or cultural respect, because Germany is a good counterexample to that notion. And it isn't about being highly decentralized in those respects either, because London and France are pretty good at counterexamples to that, especially France. So Murray proposes the idea about elite cities, not merely large or significant cities, but he uses the term elite as a possible cause for the production of significant figures. So here I'm just going to give you a sense of all the details that Murray brings up. I'm just going to read about a page and a half, and I think it's titled Talent and Critical Mass from the book, so you can get these particulars down and get a sense for the book. So under Talent and Critical Mass in this section, he writes, "Why did some cities become the cradles of significant figures while others did not? Part of the answer depends not on the city itself, but on the larger culture. Accelerant, a word used in connection with fires, seems appropriate in thinking about the role of cities. In a culture where the spark of creativity has been lit, the following are some of the combustible materials that elite cities possessed during the period from 1400 to 1950. Cities attracted human capital. As countries urbanized, some people in rural areas decided to pull up roots and move to the city, while others decided to stay put. On an individual level, these decisions were made for many reasons. Taken overall, the process tended to select for talent, ambition, industriousness, creativity, and spunk. Cities had a disproportionate amount of a nation's human capital, and the children who grew up there reflected that disproportion. The disproportionate inborn talent that each new urban generation enjoyed was augmented by educational opportunities far better than those in the countryside. Primary education reached much larger proportions of urban children than rural children. Access to secondary and university education was greater. The facilities and staffing of urban schools were better. Some cities provided more raw material than others for talented children to feed upon. In his analysis of Western civilization from ancient Greece to the first half of the 19th century, Dean Simonton discusses this raw material in terms of cultural diversity. The literature on creative personalities consistently demonstrates the importance of relativism, complexity, diversity, and richness. Simonton notes that historically, talented children who grew up in a rich, diverse cultural environment were more likely to develop than those who grew up in a culturally monolithic environment. Children who grew up in cities were also more likely to become artists and scientists, just because there is a lot of art and science going on all about them. For the visual arts and music, the first determinant of whether a city had a lot going on was a large audience. Cities where thousands of people filled concert halls and patronized art galleries tended to be the cities where artists, composers, and musicians went to work. The secondary effect of an audience was that the presence of artists and composers in a city drew other artists and composers, which made the city still more attractive. At some points in history, Paris's domination of the art world from mid-19th century until World War II is an example. The city became so conspicuously the center of activity that it acquired close to a monopoly. Not all cities have audiences for art and music. The industrial cities of England grew large over the course of the 19th century, but the money in those cities mostly belonged to first-generation entrepreneurs who were too busy to go to concerts and bought their art through agents in London and Paris. Many were self-made men who scorned the arts as diversions of the idle aristocracy. The cities with large audiences for the arts were political and financial centers of power or intellectual centers. With regard to the sciences, a city's combustible material consisted of facilities, libraries, laboratories, and colleagues. These were all the properties of universities, and small university towns accordingly produced significant figures out of proportion to their population. But urban centers could also fill that role. Some of the great cities of Europe were the homes of national libraries and research centers along with their local universities. Others were not. There is an element of circularity in this portrayal of elite cities when we are trying to explain where the significant figures worked. They went to work where the action was, and they were the cause of the action where they went to work. That circularity is a major part of the explanation for the self-reinforcing nature of streams of human accomplishment discussed in the preceding section. But again, the circularity is diminished when we consider where the significant figures grew up rather than just where they worked. In the quantitative analysis, I looked at both aspects, with the first set of regressions using the origins of significant figures as the dependent variable, and the second set using their workplaces. In both cases, the powerful stimulus given to human accomplishment by elite cities, places such as London, Paris, Florence, Vienna, and Berlin, is borne out by the quantitative record. The largest effect are found for the variables recording the size of the largest city, whether a city was a political or financial center, and whether a city was home to a leading university. So I hope that gives you a lot more of the details about the elite city theory. And I'll move on to the freedom of action theory that he goes over. So Murray says by this he means something akin to, but not exactly, the idea that is associated with constitutionally guaranteed rights, limited government, and democratic rule. Liberal democracies have not been around long enough to really test this theory regarding that form of government with respect to the production of significant figures, and so much production of such figures happened prior to this governmental development. Totalitarian states are also so new that it is hard to draw a conclusion about them, but the data we do have of their impact on the production of significant figures does support the theory that they are not helpful and in fact quite harmful to this. If you ignore legal protections given to citizens and just focus on de facto freedom that people enjoyed under various forms of rule, then the monarchies from 1400 to 1950 were just as tolerant of heterodoxy and independent thought as contemporary democracies. Murray cautions that he is not saying autocracies such as France's in the 17th and 18th century did not have their dark sides, but they did allow for their artists and scientists to flourish. In such cases, liberties could be the result of custom or a tolerant ruler. In Germany, the small geographic areas of autocratic rule, roughly 300 principalities, 51 independent cities, and nearly 2,000 counts or knights who possessed some territorial sovereignty, encouraged freedom of action from individuals living there. With regard to monarchies, Murray brings up Russia, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Balkans as examples that also prove in the quantitative analysis the theory that freedom of action, in the sense Murray means, plays a role in the production of significant figures. And these are the negative examples. So the quantitative analysis highlights the positive ones, like Germany and France, but also the negative ones, right, as here. So I think that's all I have for these three. And so I'm going to go over, the next video is going to go over the Aristotelian principle. And I'd also like to touch on, or do a video on, the impact of Thomas Aquinas on Western civilization that Murray brings up in this book, as to how it shaped Western civilization in a way that allowed it to produce something like the scientific revolution. And so that's where I'm headed. That's why I started this whole series, was to get to that. And I think you needed to understand all these other things before we get to that, so that you can fully appreciate what Thomas Aquinas did, and not just think it's a matter of having models or elite cities or population or peace or prosperity. Those things either don't play a role at all, or they play a very minimal role. And in some cases, like with models, I don't think I mentioned this, but with models you might say, well, you know, that just begs the question, where does the first model come from, right? And we're going to get into that with Thomas Aquinas. So how do you start generating models? How do you start a positive feedback loop? How do you start generating a society that has a minimum level of wealth, such that prosperity, such that you can start thinking about other things like philosophy, engineering, and so forth, rather than how do I get the next meal, or how do I put a roof over my head, or how do I keep my children from starving, you know, and so forth. So these are questions that we're still trying to answer in this video series. And I think when I go over the Aristotelian principle, and then finally this last video on Thomas Aquinas, I hope to show you through this work that Charles Murray did in his book Human Accomplishment, just exactly how the West was shaped, why the West was shaped, and why Thomas Aquinas, because I kept mentioning him in other videos, I feel is such an important figure, and why Christianity is so important. And this should also fill you in on perhaps why Jordan Peterson is always bringing up the Christian story and its central role in all these positive movements in the world. So thanks again for listening or watching, and if you like this video, please like and subscribe to my channel.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.